Weddings are meant to be moments of pure joy, days built around love, family, and the promise of a future. They're supposed to mark beginnings, not endings. But sometimes, in ways that feel almost impossible to comprehend, celebration turns into catastrophe without warning. In this video, you'll hear 3 real stories where weddings became scenes of unimaginable death. These are not legends or exaggerations. Every detail is real, documented, and deeply unsettling. These are the 3 most disturbing wedding deaths ever recorded. On the evening of September 26, 2023, families and friends gathered in the northern Iraqi town of Karakash, also known by its Arabic name Hamdania, to celebrate a wedding at the Al-Haytham Wedding Hall. In a community still healing from years of conflict and the brutal occupation of Islamic State forces, weddings were among the few occasions that brought genuine joy and hope for the future. The ceremony was filled with music, dancing, and laughter, and the hall was believed to be holding nearly 1,000 guests, far beyond its intended capacity of about 400 people. The bride and groom, young members of Karakash's close-knit Christian community, had arrived that night with dreams of a bright life together. Parents, siblings, cousins, and children filled every corner of the reception hall. Plates of food waited on tables, and indoor pyrotechnic flares were lit as the couple stepped onto the dance floor to share their first dance. Within moments, the sparks from these fireworks ignited highly flammable ceiling decorations and prefabricated plastic panels overhead. Flames shot upward, quickly spreading across the hall's interior. Guests screamed and rushed for the few exit doors available as thick smoke filled the room. The fire engulfed the venue with terrifying speed. The combustible materials that had been part of the hall's construction contributed to the inferno, causing portions of the ceiling to collapse and trapping many inside. The couple survived, suffering relatively minor burns, but for countless others the moment became a nightmare. Panic spread as choking fumes and flames overtook escape routes that were inadequate for the throng of people trying to flee.
This was the moment the fire broke out in the hall as the bride and groom danced together on their wedding day. As the ceiling started to fall, the band stopped playing as parents grabbed their children and guests ran for their lives.
Emergency responders worked frantically amid the chaos, but in the end the blaze claimed 107 confirmed lives, including children, with scores more injured by burns, smoke inhalation, or in the crush toward the exits. In the days that followed, Karakash was engulfed in grief. Funeral processions snaked through the streets as families laid their loved ones to rest, and national leaders imposed days of mourning as the scale of the tragedy became clear. Officials and investigators pointed to gross negligence. Far too many guests were admitted, fire safety standards were ignored, exits were insufficient, and the flammable building materials and decorations turned a celebration into a mass casualty event. Arrests were made of the wedding hall's owner and staff, and some local officials were dismissed for failures and oversight. The impact of the fire rippled through Iraqi society and beyond. Survivors spoke of the shock and horror they experienced. Families struggled with the loss of multiple relatives in a single moment, and advocates for stricter safety regulations used the tragedy to call for reforms to prevent future loss of life. For the community of Karakash, which had already endured displacement and violence in recent history, the wedding fire stands as an especially brutal blow. An expected moment of joy turned into an unfathomable tragedy. In the end, the Karakash wedding fire remains one of the deadliest accidental blazes in recent memory, not because of some act of malevolence, but through a catastrophic combination of overcrowding, flammable materials, and a lack of basic safety protections. A celebration intended to unite 2 families instead left a city mourning and the world reminded that in an instant, life can be replaced by loss on a scale that defies comprehension. Richard Kamakek was a private in the Ugandan military police whose life before June 26, 1994 was largely defined by his service in the strict, hierarchical environment of the armed forces. He was one of many young soldiers in Kampala, Uganda's bustling capital, and among the guests invited to a wedding celebration in the Nagura neighborhood, a gathering that, like countless others that day, was meant to be about family, community, and hope. On that afternoon, nearly 100 people from all walks of life filled the wedding venue, enjoying food, music, and dance under the bright African sky. As the festivities unfolded, Kamakek became infatuated with a young guest named Irene Adi, asking her to dance. When she politely declined his invitation, his mood shifted dramatically. Witness accounts later recounted that he repeatedly insisted she take the floor, his behavior becoming more aggressive and disruptive until other guests intervened to separate him from Irene and the dance area. In a tense moment fueled by embarrassment and alcohol, he was asked to leave the celebration. But the humiliation did not end there. Kamakek walked away from the wedding, left to his anger and wounded pride. Roughly 10 minutes later, he returned, not on foot, but carrying a semi-automatic rifle he had fetched from his military position. Without warning, he fired the first shots directly at Irene Adi, killing her instantly. Then, with deadly randomness, he swept the weapon across the crowd, bullets ripping through the joyful celebration. 14 people died at the scene, including Irene, and many more were struck by the hail of fire. 13 of the wounded would later succumb to their injuries in hospital. Within minutes, the wedding had transformed from a scene of celebration into a chaotic massacre. After the shooting, Kamakek turned the rifle on himself, attempting suicide by shooting himself in the mouth. Miraculously, this self-inflicted wound left him wounded but alive. He collapsed among the bodies of his victims, feigning death long enough for police to arrive and secure the site. Officers formed a protective cordon around him to prevent enraged survivors from exacting vigilante justice. But one man breached that protection. Irene Adi's own father, devastated by the loss of his daughter, fought past the police line and struck Kamakek with such force that he crushed his skull, ending the shooter's life on the very ground where so many others had perished. By day's end, 27 people lay dead as a direct result of what had begun as a joyful celebration. The aftermath of the massacre was a night of shock and grief in Kampala. Families mourned lost loved ones, and the community struggled to process how a moment of celebration, joyous music, laughter, shared meals, had erupted into sudden, senseless violence. Survivors and bereaved relatives called for accountability, questioning how a person armed and trained in the use of weapons could so easily slip from groomed soldier to mass killer, and what social or psychological forces had driven Kamakek to turn his humiliation into homicidal rage. Even decades later, the Kampala wedding massacre remains a haunting chapter in Uganda's history. A day that had promised union and happiness instead ended in slaughter, leaving families without parents, children without guardians, and a community with memories that could never again separate weddings from grief. The echoes of that violence endure not only in the names of the victims, but in the unanswered questions about rage, rejection, and the human cost when celebration turns to carnage. Rosemary do Nascimento Silva was a 32-year-old auxiliary nurse from the state of São Paulo, Brazil. By all accounts, she was thoughtful, loving, and deeply excited about marrying her fiancé, Uterly Marques de Maceno, whom she planned to spend the rest of her life with. Friends and family described her as someone who embraced life's milestones with enthusiasm, and she was eagerly preparing for what should have been one of the happiest days of her life, her wedding day. On December 4th, 2016, Rosemary decided to make that day unforgettable with a surprise entrance she had dreamed about since childhood, arriving at the ceremony by helicopter. She arranged for a Robinson R-44 helicopter flight from near São Paulo to the Recanto Beija-Flor event space in São Lourenço de Serra, where about 300 guests were waiting for the celebration to begin. Only a handful of people, including the wedding organizer, knew about the plan. Her fiancé himself was unaware she would be arriving by air. Rosemere climbed aboard the helicopter that afternoon with 3 others. Her brother, Silvano Nascimento da Silva, the wedding photographer, Nela Cristina Neves Losada, who was 6 months pregnant, and the pilot, Peterson Pinheiro. The flight took off under conditions that would soon turn tragic. As they neared the destination, just a short distance from the wedding venue, the helicopter encountered trouble. It crashed into a wooded area near the road in São Lourenço de Serra just minutes before the ceremony was to begin. All 4 occupants of the helicopter were killed instantly in the crash, including Rosemere, still dressed in her wedding gown and veil. The aftermath was utter devastation for everyone involved. At the wedding site, guests and the groom were left confused and anxious as minutes passed with no sign of the bride. Word of the crash eventually reached the event location, where shock and sorrow replaced what had been anticipation and celebration. Uterly, who had been waiting at the altar, was plunged into grief upon learning that his bride had died before she could walk down the aisle. Family members mourned not just Rosemere, but also her brother and the pregnant photographer, while the pilot's family grappled with their own loss. Investigators, including Brazil's Corpo de Bombeiros and aviation authorities, examined the site and wreckage, seeking to understand what had caused the helicopter to fail so catastrophically so close to its destination. While specific technical causes were explored in official inquiries, the public focus remained on the heartbreak of a bride whose dream entrance had ended in tragedy. The incident resonated deeply across Brazil, with conversations about safety, weather considerations, and the risks of aerial stunts in personal celebrations intensifying amid national mourning. Today, the helicopter crash that killed Rosemere do Nascimento Silva stands as a haunting reminder of how quickly joy can turn into indescribable loss. A moment intended to be spectacular instead became a permanent scar for her family, her fiancé, and all who had gathered to witness a union that never came to be, leaving behind a shockingly unexpected end to what should have been the beginning of a life together.